In the spring of 1993, in a quiet suburban community in Ohio, a young mother suddenly vanished, and investigators had no answers. More than 21 years later, a hidden clue finally came to light. It uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. Oak Haven was the kind of town where nothing truly bad ever happened. It was a peaceful, slow-moving American suburb surrounded by tall pine trees and endless stretches of green farmland. The neighborhoods were lined with oak trees, well-kept lawns, and houses with wide front porches. Everyone knew their neighbors. People left their doors unlocked during the day. It was a place where kids rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, and the biggest news in town was usually the high school football game on Friday night. In this quiet community lived 24-year-old Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was someone who naturally brought light into a room. She was known for her warm smile, her gentle voice, and her deep, unwavering kindness. She worked part-time as a librarian at the local elementary school, a job she absolutely loved because it allowed her to be surrounded by children. But her true joy in life, her entire world, was her own family. Sarah was married to a man named Mark, a 28-year-old insurance salesman who worked in the neighboring city. They had been married for 5 years and lived in a modest, two-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. But the undisputed center of Sarah's universe was her 4-year-old son, Leo. Anyone who knew Sarah knew that she lived and breathed for that little boy. She was the kind of mother who poured every ounce of her energy into making her child's life magical. She baked cookies with him on rainy afternoons, spent hours building elaborate forts out of living room blankets, and never missed a single bedtime story. She was fiercely protective and deeply attached. Her friends often joked that she and Leo were completely inseparable. That deep, unbreakable bond between a mother and her son makes what happened next so utterly impossible to understand. It was May 9, 1993, Mother's Day. The morning started like any other quiet Sunday in Oak Haven. The sun rose early, casting a soft, golden light over the neighborhood. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming spring flowers and morning dew. Inside the Jenkins home, the house was still and quiet. It was 6:45 in the morning. Mark and little Leo were still fast asleep in their beds. Sarah woke up early. She had a special tradition for Sunday mornings, especially holidays. She loved to surprise her family with fresh pastries from Miller's Bakery, a small, family-owned shop located just 2 miles down the main county road. She quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her husband. She threw on a light blue denim jacket over her clothes, grabbed her purse from the kitchen counter, and picked up her car keys. Before leaving, she walked quietly into Leo's bedroom. She stood by the doorway for a moment, watching his small chest rise and fall as he slept, clutching his favorite stuffed bear. She gently kissed his forehead, pulling the blanket up over his shoulders. At exactly 7:00 a.m., Sarah walked out the front door. She got into her dark green family station wagon, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. A neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson who was out fetching his morning newspaper, saw her drive away. He waved at her. She smiled and waved back. That simple, friendly wave was the very last time anyone in Oak Haven ever saw Sarah Jenkins. At 7:45 a.m., Mark woke up. He noticed Sarah wasn't in bed, but he didn't think much of it. He assumed she was downstairs in the kitchen making coffee or sitting on the back patio reading a book. He stretched, got out of bed, and walked downstairs. The house was empty. The coffee pot was cold. He noticed her car was missing from the driveway. He smiled to himself, assuming she had run out to the bakery to get breakfast for Mother's Day. It was a sweet gesture, something she did often. He put on a pot of coffee and waited for his son to wake up. By 8:30 a.m., little Leo was awake, rubbing his eyes and asking where his mommy was. Mark poured him a bowl of cereal and told him she would be right back with a surprise. But the clock kept ticking. 9:00 a.m. 9:30 a.m. Mild annoyance began to slowly twist into a tight knot of anxiety in Mark's stomach. Miller's bakery was only a 5-minute drive away. Even if there was a long line for Mother's Day, she should have been home an hour ago. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe she ran into a friend and lost track of time talking. Maybe she got a flat tire. But this was 1993. There were no cell phones. If she had car trouble, she would have walked to a payphone and called the house. By 10:00 a.m., the anxiety turned into genuine panic. Mark picked up the wall phone in the kitchen and dialed the bakery. The owner, Mr. Miller, answered. Mark asked if Sarah was there or if she had come by earlier that morning. Mr. Miller's answer made Mark's blood run completely cold. No, Mark, I haven't seen Sarah all morning. I've been working the front counter since 6 o'clock. She never came in. Panic set in. Mark immediately called Sarah's mother, Evelyn, who lived on the other side of town. Evelyn was a sharp, observant woman who shared an incredibly close relationship with her daughter. When Mark told her Sarah had been gone for 3 hours to run a 5-minute errand, Evelyn didn't hesitate. She knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. Her daughter was deeply responsible. She would never leave her 4-year-old son waiting on Mother's Day. Evelyn told Mark to stay at the house in case Sarah called, while she drove the route to the bakery to look for her. Evelyn got into her car and drove out of town, turning onto Route 9. It was a quiet, 2-lane country road lined with dense pine woods and steep gravel shoulders. It was the only direct path between the Jenkins neighborhood and the bakery. Evelyn drove slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs, scanning the ditches and the tree line, praying she wouldn't see a crashed vehicle. About a mile outside of town, exactly halfway to the bakery, Evelyn saw it. Parked neatly on the gravel shoulder of the road, facing the direction of the bakery, was the dark green station wagon. Evelyn slammed on her brakes and pulled in behind the car. She jumped out, screaming her daughter's name. Sarah, Sarah. Her voice echoed through the silent pine trees, but there was no answer, only the quiet rustling of the wind through the branches. Evelyn ran to the driver's side window and looked inside. What she saw made absolutely no sense. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. The car was completely empty, but it looked as though someone had simply pressed pause on reality. The driver's side door was closed, but unlocked. The keys were still sitting in the ignition. The engine was turned off. On the passenger seat rested Sarah's brown leather purse. With trembling hands, Evelyn opened the car door and grabbed the purse. She unzipped it. Everything was still inside. Her wallet, her driver's license, her family photos, and exactly $24 in cash. There was no broken glass. There were no scuff marks on the gravel. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, and no indication that another vehicle had struck her. The car was in perfect working condition. Sarah was just gone. Evelyn rushed to a nearby gas station and called the police. Within 30 minutes, Oakhaven police cruisers had descended on Route 9. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the peaceful Sunday morning. Officers taped off the area around the station wagon. They brought in tracking dogs to search the surrounding woods, hoping Sarah had simply wandered off due to a medical emergency or a sudden bout of confusion. But the dogs lost her scent exactly at the edge of the asphalt. It was as if she had stepped out of her vehicle and simply floated up into the sky. Back at the house, the reality of the nightmare was beginning to unfold. The police arrived to question Mark. They searched the house. They asked him over and over again about their marriage, about any arguments, about any reason she might have to walk away. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his face pale and buried in his hands. He was in a state of pure shock. He kept repeating the same words. She wouldn't just leave. She was going to get cinnamon rolls. She kissed Leo goodbye. As the afternoon slowly turned into evening, the sun began to set on Mother's Day. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple. In the living room, 4-year-old Leo sat on the floor, holding his favorite stuffed bear. He looked up at the police officers walking through his house. He looked at his grandmother, who was standing in the corner quietly weeping into a tissue. And then he asked the question that broke the heart of every single person in the room. "When is Mommy coming home?" Nobody had an answer. The police were completely baffled. A young, devoted mother with no history of mental illness, no enemies and no reason to disappear, had vanished into thin air in broad daylight. She hadn't taken her money, her ID, or her car. But as night fell over the quiet town of Oakhaven, a chilling realization settled over the investigators. People don't just disappear. Someone, or something, had intercepted Sarah Jenkins on that quiet stretch of road. Where did she go in those 2 miles? Why did she stop her car? Who was waiting for her in the morning mist? The answers were hiding in the shadows, waiting to be found. But the truth was far darker and far more complex than anyone in that small town could possibly imagine. The days immediately following May 9th were a blur of flashing sirens, ringing telephones, and endless, agonizing questions. Oakhaven transformed overnight. The quiet, peaceful town became the center of a massive, frantic police operation. The community was absolutely shaken to its core. Things like this simply did not happen in their neighborhood. By Monday morning, a command center had been set up at the local high school gymnasium. Hundreds of volunteers poured in to help. Neighbors, teachers, shop owners, and even people from neighboring counties arrived in droves. They wore heavy boots and carried walking sticks, ready to comb through the dense pine woods that lined Route 9. They formed long lines, standing shoulder to shoulder, and walked miles through the heavy underbrush. They searched ravines, checked abandoned barns, and waded through shallow creeks. Helicopters flew overhead, their blades chopping through the quiet suburban air, while police dogs sniffed the ground below. Missing person flyers were printed by the thousands. Within 48 hours, Sarah's smiling face was everywhere. Her picture was taped to every telephone pole, every grocery store window, and every gas station pump within a 50-mile radius. The entire town was looking for her. Everyone wanted to bring Sarah home. But despite the massive effort, they found absolutely nothing. Not a piece of torn clothing, not a dropped shoe, not a single trace of her. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective David Carter. He was a seasoned, 20-year veteran of the county police force. He was a quiet, methodical man who had seen his fair share of tragedy. Carter knew the grim statistics of missing persons cases. He knew that when a married woman vanishes, the husband is always the first and most likely suspect. On Tuesday afternoon, Mark Jenkins was brought into the police station. It was standard procedure, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. The interrogation room was small, cold, and brightly lit. For 6 grueling hours, Detective Carter and his partner questioned Mark about every single detail of his life. They asked about their marriage. Were they having financial problems? Had they been arguing? Was there any history of violence? Was she seeing another man? Mark answered every question through a veil of tears. He was cooperative, desperate, and completely broken. He voluntarily gave the police his fingerprints, his DNA, and permission to search every inch of his home, his bank accounts, and his vehicle. He even agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed without a single moment of hesitation. The police quickly verified his alibi. Neighbors had seen Mark's car in the driveway all morning, and the timeline was incredibly tight. Mark was officially cleared as a suspect. He was just a grieving husband, thrust into a waking nightmare. With Mark ruled out, the police turned their attention fully to Sarah's life. Investigators often say that no one's life is completely perfectly clean. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has a hidden bank account, a private struggle, or a skeleton in the closet. But as Detective Carter dug deeper into Sarah Jenkins, he found a life that was entirely transparent. They pulled her phone records. There were no late-night calls to strange numbers. There was no secret pager. Her bank statements showed only ordinary purchases: groceries, gasoline, and small toys for Leo. They spoke to her coworkers at the library, her childhood friends, and her neighbors. Everyone said the exact same thing. Sarah was a devoted, loving mother who was deeply attached to her family. She had no history of mental illness. She had never spoken about wanting to run away. She had no known enemies. She was exactly who she appeared to be. This made the investigation incredibly frustrating. Without a motive, without an enemy, and without a secret life, the police had no direction to look. The physical evidence was even more baffling. Crime scene technicians spent days going over the dark green station wagon. They dusted the steering wheel, the door handles, and the rearview mirror for fingerprints. They vacuumed the floorboards, searching for foreign hair, soil, or clothing fibers. They even used special chemicals to check for any microscopic traces of blood. The results were completely empty. The car was clean. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no scuff marks on the doors. It was as if Sarah had simply parked the car, opened the door, and evaporated into the morning air. Then the police managed to piece together a timeline, and what they discovered was absolutely chilling. They knew from the elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson, that Sarah had backed out of her driveway at exactly 7:00 a.m. Route 9 was a straight, direct path to the bakery. On Wednesday, a local delivery driver named Tom Higgins came forward. He told police that he had been driving down Route 9 on Sunday morning, delivering a load of fresh produce to a market in the next town over. He specifically remembered seeing the dark green station wagon parked on the gravel shoulder. Detective Carter asked him what time he drove past the car. Tom Higgins checked his delivery log. He had passed the spot at exactly 7:12 a.m. He told the police that the car was just sitting there. He didn't see a woman walking on the side of the road. He didn't see another vehicle parked nearby. He didn't see anyone in the woods. Detective Carter stared at the timeline on his whiteboard. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. From the moment Sarah left her driveway to the moment the delivery driver saw her empty car, only 12 minutes had passed. 12 minutes. In a window of just 12 minutes, Sarah drove a mile down the road, stopped her car, and completely disappeared from the face of the earth. It was terrifyingly fast. It left no room for a long struggle, no room for her to wander off, and no room for mistakes. Whoever took Sarah, or whatever happened to her, happened with lightning speed. As the weeks turned into months, the initial wave of community support slowly began to fade. The reality of life set back in. People had to return to their jobs. The massive search parties were called off. The yellow ribbons tied around the oak trees in town began to fray and lose their color in the summer rain. The missing person posters in the shop windows started to curl at the edges, eventually replaced by advertisements for local fairs and bake sales. But inside the Jenkins home, time stood completely still. They were trapped in a cruel, endless purgatory. Psychologists call it ambiguous loss, the profound grief of losing a loved one without any physical proof of death. Without a body, without a funeral, and without an answer, there is no closure. The mind constantly loops between desperate hope and crushing despair. Mark struggled to keep his life together. He returned to work, moving through his days like a ghost. He tried his best to be a good father to Leo, but the house felt overwhelmingly empty. Every time the telephone rang, Mark's heart would leap into his throat. Every time a car drove slowly past their house, he would run to the front window, hoping to see Sarah walking up the driveway. But it was never her. Evelyn, Sarah's mother, refused to give up. She spent her evenings driving up and down Route 9, shining a heavy flashlight into the dark woods. She called the police station every single week, demanding updates, begging them not to forget her daughter. But Detective Carter had nothing to give her. The leads had completely dried up. The tips that came in were dead ends. A year passed, then two. The case grew painfully cold. By 1995, the Oak Haven police officially classified Sarah Jenkins as a long-term missing person. Her file was placed in a cardboard box and stored in the basement records room. The world kept spinning, leaving Mark and little Leo behind in the wreckage. But mysteries like this rarely stay buried forever. Sometimes, the smallest, most overlooked detail can break a case wide open. 14 months after the disappearance, the police department finally released the dark green station wagon back to Mark. It had been sitting in the police impound lot for over a year, trapped behind a chain-link fence, collecting dust and dead leaves. Mark didn't want the car. He couldn't bear to look at it. It was a metal tomb, a constant, painful reminder of the worst day of his life. He decided he needed to sell it to a used car dealership in the city. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Mark took a taxi to the impound lot with his spare set of keys. He signed the release paperwork and walked across the cracked asphalt toward the station wagon. He unlocked the driver's side door and pulled it open. A wave of stale, hot air hit his face. The car smelled like old upholstery and dust. For a moment he just stood there, overwhelmed by a sudden, violent wave of grief. He could almost picture Sarah sitting there, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, turning her head to smile at him. He wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and sat down in the driver's seat to start the engine. As he swung his legs inside, he noticed something instantly. Mark was a tall man, standing just over 6 feet. Normally, whenever he drove Sarah's car, he had to reach down and pull the metal lever under the seat to slide it all the way backward. Sarah was only 5'3". She had to sit extremely close to the steering wheel just to reach the pedals. But today, Mark didn't have to adjust the seat. His long legs fit perfectly. His feet comfortably rested on the brake and the gas pedal. The seat was already pushed as far back as it could possibly go. Mark froze. His hands gripped the steering wheel. Something felt wrong, really wrong. Why would Sarah push the seat all the way back? She physically couldn't drive the car in this position. Her feet wouldn't even touch the floor. A cold chill crawled up the back of Mark's neck. He looked up at the rearview mirror. It was tilted high, angled upward to accommodate the eye level of a tall person. His breathing grew shallow. He reached over and opened the glove compartment. Inside was a small, black, spiral-bound notebook. Mark had always been meticulous about vehicle maintenance. He kept a strict log of every oil change, writing down the date and the exact mileage of the car. He flipped the notebook open to the last entry. He had personally changed the oil in the station wagon on May 8th, the Saturday afternoon before Mother's Day, the day before she vanished. He had written down the mileage, 42,110 miles *. Slowly, his hands shaking, Mark looked through the steering wheel at the dashboard display. He stared at the digital odometer glowing faintly in the shadow of the dashboard. The number staring back at him was *42, 135 *. Mark's mind raced, trying to process the numbers. The car had been driven 25 miles since the oil change. But the bakery was only 2 miles away from their house, and the spot on Route 9 where the car was found was only 1 mile away. If Sarah had left the house and driven straight to that gravel shoulder, the odometer should only show 1 single mile. Where did the other 24 miles come from? Mark stepped out of the car, his heart hammering against his ribs. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Sarah hadn't driven the car to that gravel shoulder. Someone else had. A tall person. Someone who needed the seat pushed all the way back. Someone who had driven the car somewhere else entirely that morning, for 24 miles, before parking it neatly on Route 9, leaving the keys in the ignition and the purse on the seat, deliberately creating a fake crime scene. The police had spent years looking at a 12-minute window on a 1-mile stretch of road, but they were looking in the wrong place. The disappearance wasn't a sudden, random abduction. It was a staged event. Sarah hadn't just vanished. She had been erased, and whoever did it was incredibly smart, incredibly careful, and had left behind a 24-mile trail that no one had ever looked for. The mystery was no longer about where she went. It was about who had taken the wheel. Mark did not wait. He slammed the car door shut, grabbed the small black notebook from the glove compartment, and drove straight to the Oakhaven police station. He practically sprinted through the double doors, demanding to see Detective Carter. When Carter looked at the oil change log and the odometer, his face drained of color. He instantly realized the gravity of his mistake. The entire investigation had been built on a foundation of sand. They had focused all their energy, all their dogs, and all their search teams on a tiny 1-mile stretch of road. But the numbers didn't lie. The dark green station wagon had been driven exactly 25 miles since the previous afternoon. Carter pulled out a massive topographical map of the county and pinned it to the corkboard in his office. He took a drawing compass, placed the sharp metal tip exactly on the Jenkins house, and measured out a radius of 12.5 miles. He drew a large red circle around Oakhaven. 12.5 miles out and 12.5 miles back, Carter muttered, staring at the map. Whoever took her drove her somewhere within this circle. They did what they had to do, and then they drove the car back, parking it on Route 9 to make us think she vanished on her way to the bakery. But the red circle was a nightmare for an investigator. A 12-mile radius in rural Ohio covered over 450 square miles. It encompassed vast stretches of state forest, dozens of deep water quarries, hundreds of private farms, and endless networks of abandoned logging roads. Without knowing which direction the car had traveled, searching the entire circle was physically impossible. They sent out patrol cars to check the major roads within the radius. They knocked on doors and asked if anyone had seen the green station wagon on Mother's Day morning. But 14 months had already passed. People's memories had faded. No one remembered anything. The case hit a massive, impenetrable wall. The 24 unaccounted miles became the most haunting detail of the entire investigation, a dark puzzle that seemed entirely unsolvable. And so, the cruel passage of time began to bury the story of Sarah Jenkins. Years turned into decades. The world moved forward, leaving the mystery behind. The 1990s gave way to the 2000s. The quiet town of Oakhaven slowly changed. New families moved in, new houses were built, and the people who remembered the young mother who vanished on Mother's Day began to grow old. In 2005, Sarah's mother, Evelyn, passed away from a sudden heart attack. She died with a broken heart, her final words expressing the deep, agonizing pain of never knowing what happened to her little girl. Mark never remarried. He couldn't. He lived in the exact same house at the end of the cul-de-sac. He kept the house looking the same, almost like a museum. He kept Sarah's favorite books on the shelves. He kept her clothes in the closet. He was a man frozen in time, quietly suffering through every single holiday, every anniversary, and every empty morning. But Mark did an incredible job raising Leo. Leo grew from a confused 4-year-old boy into a kind, highly intelligent, and deeply thoughtful young man. He had his mother's warm, gentle eyes and her calm demeanor, but growing up in the shadow of a local ghost story carried a heavy emotional weight. Leo had no real memories of his mother. He only knew her through photographs, through his father's stories, and through the old, fatting missing person flyers he occasionally found tucked away in the basement. 21 years passed. It was May 2014, the 21st anniversary of the disappearance. Leo was now 25 years old, working as an English teacher at the local high school. He had moved back into his childhood home to help care for Mark, whose health had begun to decline with age. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Leo pulled into the driveway after a long day of teaching. He walked up to the front porch and unlocked the heavy metal mailbox attached to the brick wall. He pulled out a stack of envelopes. Most of it was the usual pile of junk mail, electric bills, and grocery store flyers. But buried in the middle of the stack was a strange envelope. It was an old, slightly yellowed manila envelope. The paper felt thick and heavily textured, as if it had been sitting in a damp drawer for a very long time. There was no return address. The front simply read, "To the Jenkins family," written in a shaky, uneven script. The postage stamps were unusually old, and the postmark stamp across them was heavily smeared, though the date clearly showed it had been processed just 3 days ago at a sorting facility in a neighboring city. Leo didn't think much of it at first. He assumed it was old legal paperwork regarding his grandmother's estate. He carried the mail inside, dropped his keys on the kitchen counter, and sat down at the table across from his father. Mark was quietly sipping a cup of coffee, reading the afternoon newspaper. Leo picked up a butter knife and sliced open the top of the manila envelope. He tilted it upside down to slide the contents out onto the table. There was a heavy, metallic clink as something solid struck the hard wooden surface of the table. Mark slowly lowered his newspaper, his eyes locked onto the object resting on the wood. The color instantly drained from his face. His hands began to tremble so violently that he spilled coffee onto his lap. He couldn't breathe. Dad, what is it?" Leo asked, his voice filled with sudden alarm. Mark reached out with a shaking hand. He picked up the object. It was a small, tarnished silver locket on a broken chain. "It's hers," Mark whispered, his voice cracking into a dry sob. "It's your mother's. She never took it off. She was wearing it the morning she left." Leo felt a cold chill wash over his entire body. He looked inside the envelope. There was a single piece of lined notebook paper neatly folded into thirds. Leo pulled it out. The paper was brittle. The ink was faded blue ballpoint pen. The handwriting matched the shaky, uneven script on the front of the envelope. It was the writing of someone whose hands were incredibly weak. Leo began to read the letter out loud. His voice shook with every word. "To Mark and Leo, I am writing this because my time is entirely gone. The doctors told me yesterday that the cancer has spread through my lungs and into my brain. I have only a few weeks left. I cannot leave this earth carrying the weight of what I saw. I cannot face God with this secret in my soul. I was a coward 21 years ago. I am so deeply sorry." Leo stopped. He looked up at his father. Mark was frozen, tears streaming silently down his weathered cheeks. "I know you have spent your lives wondering where she went. The police looked everywhere, but they looked in the wrong places. They didn't know about the 12 miles, but I did, because I was there that morning. I was hunting on the old Miller property before the sun came up." Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. The old Miller property. It was a massive, privately owned tract of dense forest located on the northern edge of the county. It was exactly 12 miles away from their house. It was located right on the edge of the red circle Detective Carter had drawn on the map 2 decades ago. Leo continued reading, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I saw the green car drive up the old logging path. I saw who was driving it. I hid in the tree line because I knew I was trespassing. I watched them pull her out of the passenger side. She wasn't moving. I was too terrified to step forward. I just watched them carry her into the old stone root cellar behind the collapsed hunting cabin. I watched them lock the heavy iron door from the outside. I found her locket in the dirt after they drove away. I took it and I ran. I never said a word because of who he was. If you want the truth, go to the root cellar." The letter ended there. There was no signature, no name, just the crushing weight of a 21-year-old secret. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Who was driving the car? Who was so powerful or so terrifying that a grown man would stay completely silent for 2 decades? Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed the house phone and dialed the police station. Within 20 minutes, Detective Carter arrived at the house. Carter was much older now. His hair was completely white, and he walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were just as sharp as they had been in 1993. The Sarah Jenkins case was the one ghost that had haunted his entire career. He had never let it go. When Carter read the letter and saw the silver locket, he didn't waste a single second. He called in 2 active patrol units and an evidence team. "We're going to the Miller property," Carter ordered. The drive took exactly 22 minutes. The police cruisers, followed closely by Mark and Leo in their own truck, turned off the main highway and drove down a heavily overgrown, forgotten logging road. The trees grew thick and close together, blocking out the afternoon sun. The air felt heavy and damp. They reached a clearing surrounded by tall, dying oak trees. In the center of the clearing stood the rotting, collapsed remains of a wooden hunting cabin. It looked completely abandoned, choked by thick vines and tall weeds. Carter drew his flashlight. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, unholstering their weapons just in case, though the letter implied the place had been abandoned for years. Mark and Leo followed closely behind, their hearts pounding in their chests. They walked around the back of the collapsed cabin. There, half buried beneath a pile of rotting wood and dead leaves, were 2 heavy, slanted wooden doors set into the stone foundation. It was the root cellar. Wrapped tightly around the iron handles of the doors was a thick, rusted steel chain, secured by a heavy brass padlock. The padlock was locked from the outside. "Get the bolt cutters," Carter yelled to one of the officers. The officer ran to the cruiser and returned with a pair of heavy iron cutters. He snapped the rusted padlock with a loud crack. The chain fell away, hitting the stone ground with a heavy thud. Carter grabbed the iron handle. He took a deep breath, looking back at Mark and Leo. He pulled the heavy wooden door open. The rusted hinges screamed in protest. A rush of cold, horribly stale air blew up from the darkness below. It smelled like damp earth, old stone, and something deeply wrong. Carter clicked on his heavy tactical flashlight. He aimed the bright white beam down the narrow, crumbling stone steps. The light cut through the thick darkness, sweeping across the dirt floor of the underground room. Mark let out a choked, suffocating gasp. Leo took a step back, his hands covering his mouth in pure shock. Resting in the corner of the cellar, perfectly illuminated by the beam of light, was a wooden chair. Draped neatly over the back of the chair was a faded, light blue denim jacket. But it wasn't just the jacket that made their blood run cold. Lying on the dirt floor directly beneath the chair was a large, heavy canvas duffel bag. The bag was unzipped, and spilling out from the darkness of the heavy canvas were dozens of smooth, pure white human bones. The silence in the root cellar was absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of Mark Jenkins trying to breathe. The beam of Detective Carter's heavy tactical flashlight remained locked on the corner of the small underground room. Dust motes danced in the bright white light, settling slowly over the damp, packed dirt floor. The light blue denim jacket rested perfectly over the back of the wooden chair. It looked exactly as it had 21 years ago. The color hadn't faded in the dark. It was a perfectly preserved piece of 1993, waiting patiently in the cold. But beneath the chair, spilling from the heavy canvas duffel bag, the pure white bones told the terrifying truth of what had actually happened to the young mother of Oakhaven. Mark's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the damp stone floor of the cellar, letting out a sound that was less of a cry and more of a hollow, agonizing scream. It was the sound of 21 years of desperate hope finally shattering into a million sharp, jagged pieces. For over 2 decades, a small, quiet part of his mind had always believed that Sarah was out there somewhere. Maybe she had lost her memory. Maybe she had started a new life. Maybe, just maybe, she would walk up the driveway one afternoon. But she had never left. She had been here, locked in the dark, just 12 miles away from her home. Leo dropped to his knees beside his father. Tears were streaming down his face, but he didn't make a sound. He wrapped his arms tightly around Mark's shaking shoulders, holding him as the older man completely fell apart. Leah stared at the blue jacket. It was the jacket from the photographs. The jacket his mother had worn the morning she kissed his forehead and promised to come right back. Detective Carter felt a deep, sickening twist in his stomach. He was a veteran cop who had seen terrible things, but the sheer cruelty of this room made his chest feel incredibly tight. He slowly backed away toward the stone stairs. "We need to get out," Carter said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to lock down the scene. Don't touch anything." Carter guided Mark and Leo up the crumbling stone steps and back out into the fading afternoon sunlight. The air outside felt suddenly warm and clean compared to the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the cellar. Carter immediately grabbed the radio attached to his shoulder. He called dispatch, his voice shaking slightly. He requested a full crime scene unit, the county coroner, and heavy floodlights. Within an hour, the quiet, abandoned clearing was transformed. Bright halogen work lights were set up around the collapsed hunting cabin, pushing back the growing shadows of the forest. Technicians in full white protective suits carefully descended into the root cellar. They strung up bright yellow police tape around the stone foundation. Carter stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the technicians work. His mind was racing, shifting from the emotional shock of the discovery into the cold, calculated mindset of a homicide investigator. The initial forensics painted a grim and terrifying picture. The technicians confirmed that the heavy brass padlock had been locked from the outside. There was no secondary exit. The cellar was essentially a stone vault. Whoever put Sarah down there had deliberately trapped her. They carefully examined the heavy canvas duffel bag resting on the dirt floor. It wasn't a standard piece of luggage. It was an olive-green, military-style deployment bag made of thick, weather-resistant canvas, secured by a heavy brass zipper. It was the kind of equipment issued to law enforcement tactical units or military personnel. It was rugged, durable, and designed to carry heavy loads. But as the coroner slowly began to catalog the remains, a deeper, more profound mystery began to take shape in Detective Carter's mind. He drove back to the Oak Haven police station late that night, leaving the crime scene to the forensics team. The station was quiet. Most of the officers had gone home for the evening. Carter walked into his private office, shut the door, and locked it. He walked over to the large whiteboard hanging on the wall. He grabbed a thick black marker and erased a list of old suspect names he had written years ago. He stood in front of the blank white surface, his mind spinning back to the most frustrating piece of evidence in the entire case: the 24 unaccounted miles. Carter began to write. He wrote down the mileage from Mark's notebook, 42,110. He wrote down the mileage found on the odometer 14 months later, 42,135. He drew a heavy circle around the difference, 25 miles. For 21 years, the police had believed that Sarah left her house at 7:00 a.m., drove 1 mile toward the bakery, and was intercepted on Route 9 by a random attacker in a 12-minute window. But Carter now knew she had been taken to the old Miller property, exactly 12 miles away. He pressed the tip of the black marker against the whiteboard. He drew a small square to represent the Jenkins house. He drew a line outward to a small circle, representing the hunting cabin. He wrote the number 12 above the line. Then he drew a line back from the cabin to the house. He wrote the number 12 again. Finally, he drew a short line from the house to a small X, representing the spot on Route 9 where the car was found abandoned. He wrote the number 1. 12 plus 12 plus 1. It equaled exactly 25 miles. Carter stepped back. The marker slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. The breath left his lungs as the absolute brilliance and the absolute horror of the killer's plan finally became clear. The timeline they had been working with for 2 decades was a complete lie. Sarah didn't vanish at 7:00 a.m. The abduction had happened hours earlier in the dead of night while the entire town was asleep. The killer had entered the Jenkins home. He had taken Sarah, put her in the family station wagon, and driven the 12 miles out to the old logging road. He had locked her in the root cellar. But then the killer did something incredibly smart. He didn't abandon the car in the woods. He drove the 12 miles back to the Jenkins house. He parked the car perfectly back in the driveway. He went back inside the house, placing the keys on the kitchen counter. And then he waited. He waited until the sun came up. He waited until Mark and little Leo were fast asleep upstairs. At 7:00 a.m., the killer picked up the keys. He grabbed Sarah's purse. He took her light blue denim jacket. He put the jacket on, pulled it tight over his shoulders, and got into the driver's seat. He pushed the seat all the way back to accommodate his tall frame. He backed the car out of the driveway. When the elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson, stepped out to get his newspaper and waved, he didn't see Sarah. He saw a person wearing her blue jacket behind the steering wheel of her car. He simply assumed it was her. The killer then drove the car 1 single mile down Route 9. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder, left the keys in the ignition, tossed the purse on the passenger seat, took off the jacket, and simply walked away into the morning mist. It was a masterclass in misdirection. The killer had created a fake crime scene, complete with a fake witness sighting, to make the police believe she vanished on her way to the bakery. He had deliberately focused the entire massive police search on a 1-mile radius, knowing full well she was locked in a stone vault 12 miles away in the opposite direction. Carter felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. To pull this off, the killer had to be intimately familiar with police procedure. He knew how search grids worked. He knew how witness statements dictated the direction of an investigation. He knew exactly how to manipulate the entire department. And more terrifyingly, he had access to the Jenkins house. He moved through the rooms in the dark without waking Mark or the dog. He knew where the keys were kept. Carter rushed back to his desk. He grabbed the manila envelope that had arrived in Leo's mail that afternoon. He carefully pulled out the letter from the dying hunter. He read the final lines again, his eyes scanning the faded blue ink. I watched them pull her out of the passenger side. I watched them carry her into the old stone root cellar. I never said a word because of who he was. Who he was. The hunter recognized the driver of the green station wagon. A tall man. A man so powerful or so terrifying that a witness would choose to carry the secret to his grave rather than go to the authorities. Carter knew he had to find the hunter. He had to know the name. He picked up a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and held it over the smeared postmark on the front of the envelope. The ink was faded, but under the bright desk lamp, he could barely make out the zip code and the processing location. It had been mailed from Crestwood, a larger industrial city located about 30 miles north of Oak Haven. The letter stated the writer had terminal cancer that had spread to his brain, and he had only weeks to live. The shaky handwriting suggested he was already in the final stages of physical decline. It was now late Tuesday night. Carter picked up his phone and dialed the Crestwood Medical Center. He identified himself as a homicide detective and asked to speak to the nursing director of the oncology ward. He requested a rapid search of their patient records. He was looking for an elderly male patient with terminal lung or brain cancer who was either currently in hospice care or who had passed away within the last 48 hours. The nursing director put him on hold. Carter listened to the dead air on the line, his heart pounding in his ears. Every second felt like an hour. Finally, the nurse came back on the line. "Detective, we have one match," she said softly. "A patient named Arthur Vance. He was 71 years old. He was discharged to home hospice care last Thursday. I'm sorry, detective, but Mr. Vance passed away Sunday evening at his home." Carter wrote the name down on a yellow legal pad. Arthur Vance. "Do you have a home address for his next of kin?" Carter asked. By sunrise on Wednesday morning, Detective Carter was pulling his unmarked police cruiser into the driveway of a small, faded brick house on the outskirts of Crestwood. The lawn was neatly cut, and a single porch light was still burning in the early dawn. Carter knocked gently on the front door. A few moments later, it was opened by an elderly woman. She wore a heavy knit sweater and looked incredibly fragile. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Carter held up his gold detective's badge. "Mrs. Vance, my name is Detective David Carter. I'm so deeply sorry for your loss. I know this is a terrible time, but I need to speak with you about your husband, Arthur." Eleanor Vance looked at the badge and then up at Carter's face. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked almost relieved. She slowly opened the door wider and motioned for him to come inside. "I knew you would come," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Arthur told me the police would eventually come. He said mailing that letter was the only way he could finally rest." Carter followed her into a small, quiet living room filled with old photographs and crocheted blankets. Eleanor sat down slowly in a worn rocking chair. Carter sat on the edge of the sofa across from her. "Mrs. Vance, your husband witnessed something terrible 21 years ago," Carter said gently. "He saw a young woman being put into a root cellar. He wrote that he kept quiet because he knew the man who did it. Can you tell me who he saw?" Eleanor pulled a tissue from her sleeve and wiped her eyes. "Arthur was never the same after that morning in the woods," she said, her voice breaking. "He used to be such a happy, gentle man, but he came home that day looking like he had seen a demon. He locked all the doors. He pulled the curtains. He started drinking heavily. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, clawing at the blankets, shouting that they were locking the door." She looked down at her shaking hands. "He told me he was hunting on the old logging road before sunrise. He saw the green car drive up. He hid behind an old oak tree. He watched two men pull a woman out of the car. She wasn't fighting. She was completely limp. They carried her in a heavy canvas bag and put her in the cellar. Arthur said one of the men was huge, a giant of a man, and when the headlights hit his face, Arthur recognized him." "How did he recognize him?" Carter asked, leaning forward, his pulse pounding in his throat. "Because he had seen his face on the television," Eleanor said softly. "He was the man leading the search parties on the evening news, the man standing at the podium telling the town to stay calm." Carter's breath caught in his lungs. "Arthur was terrified," Eleanor continued. "He said if the police were the ones doing the burying, there was no one left to call. He said if he came forward, they would put him in a cellar too." Carter felt the room spinning. The man leading the search parties, the man giving the press conferences. "Mrs. Vance," Carter said, his voice barely a whisper, "did Arthur ever say the man's name?" "No," she replied. "He refused to say the name out loud. He said speaking his name would bring the devil into our house. But—" Eleanor paused. She slowly pushed herself up from the rocking chair. She walked over to a heavy oak bookshelf in the corner of the room. She reached behind a stack of old encyclopedias and pulled out a small, heavy metal lockbox. She walked back and placed the heavy box on the coffee table in front of Carter. She handed him a small silver key. "Arthur didn't just find the woman's necklace that morning," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a harsh, frightened whisper. "He said the tall man pulled off his heavy leather gloves to wrap the chain around the cellar doors. When he pulled his glove off, something snagged. Something fell off his hand and landed in the tall grass. After the men drove away, Arthur waited for an hour. Then he crawled through the grass and found it. He kept it locked in this box for 21 years. He said it was the only proof he wasn't crazy." Carter's hand shook as he took the small silver key. He inserted it into the lockbox and turned it. The mechanism clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap. He lifted the heavy metal lid. Resting inside the dark box, sitting on a piece of folded velvet cloth, was a piece of heavy, tarnished gold jewelry. Carter reached in and picked it up, It was heavy in his palm. It was a custom-made, solid gold police commendation ring, the kind of ring given to senior officers to commemorate a major career milestone or an act of extraordinary valor. The gold band was thick and deeply scratched from years of wear, and a dark blue sapphire was set firmly into the center. Carter slowly rotated the heavy gold ring in his fingers. He angled it toward the light spilling through the living room window. Carved into the inside of the thick gold band, the engraved letters were still perfectly clear and sharp. To Detective James Rowlands, for 10 years of dedicated service, Oak Haven Police Department. Carter stared at the name. The air completely vanished from the room. The blood rushed out of his face, leaving him pale and completely cold. Detective James Rowlands. A man who stood 6'3". A man who needed the driver's seat pushed all the way back. A man who had full access to the crime scene tape. A man who had directed the tracking dogs away from the North Woods. A man who had sat right next to Carter in the interrogation room, putting a comforting hand on Mark Jenkins' shoulder, looking the grieving husband dead in the eye and promising him they would find his wife. Carter closed his fist around the heavy gold ring. The sharp edges bit deeply into his palm. The monster wasn't a stranger hiding in the woods. The monster had been sitting at the desk right next to him for the last 21 years. Detective David Carter sat in the quiet living room of the grieving widow, staring at the heavy gold ring in the palm of his hand. The scratched metal felt cold against his skin. The name engraved inside the band seemed to burn right through his eyes and into his brain. Detective James Rowlands. For 21 years, the ghost of Sarah Jenkins had haunted the town of Oak Haven. For 21 years, everyone believed a random monster had emerged from the woods, stolen a young mother away on Mother's Day, and vanished back into the shadows. But the monster had never been hiding in the woods. The monster wore a silver badge. Carter felt a wave of absolute nausea wash over him. His mind flashed back through 2 decades of memories. He remembered James Rowlands leading the massive volunteer search parties through the pine forests. He remembered Rowlands standing in front of the television news cameras, promising the community that the police would never stop looking. Most sickening of all, Carter remembered sitting in the interrogation room on the day after the disappearance. He remembered watching Rowlands place a comforting, heavy hand on Mark Jenkins' shoulder, looking the devastated husband right in the eye, and swearing he would bring his wife home. It was a level of pure, calculated evil that Carter could barely comprehend. Carter knew he could not take this evidence back to his own police department. If Rowlands had orchestrated a cover-up this massive, Carter had no idea who else in the precinct might be involved. He stood up, thanked Eleanor Vance for her incredible bravery, and walked out to his unmarked cruiser. He didn't drive back to Oak Haven. Instead, he drove straight to the state capitol. He walked into the headquarters of the State Bureau of Investigation, placed the gold ring and the confession letter on the director's desk, and demanded immediate action. The state agents moved with terrifying speed. By noon on Wednesday, James Rowlands was no longer just a detective. After 21 years of highly praised service, he had climbed the ranks. He was now the chief of police for the town of Oak Haven. Rowlands was sitting behind his large mahogany desk at the precinct, drinking a cup of coffee and reviewing budget reports, when the heavy glass doors of the station suddenly swung open. A dozen armed state agents flooded into the building. They moved with absolute precision, securing the exits, locking down the communication center, and demanding that every local officer step away from their desks. Detective Carter walked through the center of the precinct, flanked by 2 senior state investigators. He didn't look at his colleagues. He walked straight down the hallway and pushed open the door to the chief's office. Rowlands looked up from his paperwork. He was a large, intimidating man with broad shoulders and thick gray hair. For a moment, he looked annoyed by the sudden intrusion. "David, what is the meaning of this?" Rollins demanded, his deep voice filling the room. "Why are state agents in my lobby?" Carter didn't say a word. He walked slowly across the carpet. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy gold commendation ring, and dropped it right into the center of the mahogany desk. The heavy piece of gold landed with a sharp, metallic clatter. Rollins froze, his eyes locked onto the dark blue sapphire. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow wax figure. The arrogant, powerful chief of police disappeared in an instant. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy. Roland slowly raised his eyes to meet Carter's gaze. He didn't ask where the ring came from. He didn't demand an explanation. He just stared at the man who had finally caught him. "Stand up, James," Carter said, his voice trembling with years of suppressed rage. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The arrest of Chief James Rollins sent shockwaves through the entire state. The local news stations broke into their regular broadcasts. The town of Oakhaven, which had idolized the man for decades, was completely paralyzed by disbelief. But the most devastating part of the nightmare was yet to come. The state investigators needed a full confession. They needed to know exactly how, and exactly why, a decorated police officer had murdered an innocent mother. They placed Rollins in a windowless interrogation room at the state headquarters, hundreds of miles away from his own precinct. For hours, he sat in complete silence, staring blankly at the wall. But when they showed him photographs of the old Miller property, the rusted padlock, and the olive green police duffel bag, his psychological walls finally crumbled. Rollins buried his face in his hands and began to speak, and the story he told was a descent into pure madness. It wasn't a grand, complicated criminal conspiracy. It was something far more realistic and far more pathetic. It started with a dark, hidden obsession. 21 years ago, Rollins was a patrol officer who worked the night shift in Oakhaven. His patrol route frequently took him past the Jenkins house. Over time, he had developed a deep, unhealthy fixation on Sarah. He watched her watering her flowers in the afternoon. He watched her playing in the yard with little Leo. To the rest of the world, Rollins was a hero cop. But in the quiet hours of the night, he was a predator slowly losing control of his mind. On the Saturday night before Mother's Day, Rollins was off duty. He had been drinking heavily in his apartment. Sometime after midnight, the alcohol washed away his remaining common sense. He drove his personal truck into Sarah's neighborhood. He parked a few streets away and walked through the shadows to her house. He didn't plan to kill her. He told the state investigators that he only wanted to go inside. He just wanted to stand in her living room, to be close to her life. He used his police-issued tools to quietly pick the lock on the back patio door. He stepped into the dark kitchen. He stood there in the silence, listening to the house breathe. But then the floorboards upstairs creaked. Sarah had woken up. She was walking down the stairs to get a glass of water for Leo. Rollins froze in the shadows. Sarah stepped into the kitchen and reached for the light switch. The overhead lights flickered on, instantly illuminating the large police officer standing in her home. Sarah gasped in shock. She recognized him immediately from town. "Officer Rollins," she asked, completely confused and suddenly terrified. "What are you doing in my house?" In that single, terrifying second, Rollins realized his entire life was over. If she picked up the phone, he would lose his badge, his freedom, and his reputation. The panic took over completely. Survival instinct kicked in. He lunged forward. He clamped his heavy, gloved hand over Sarah's mouth before she could scream. She fought back, thrashing wildly in his grip, scratching at his face. But Rollins was 6'3" and incredibly strong. He wrestled her to the kitchen floor. He wrapped his hands around her throat and squeezed. He held her down until she stopped fighting, until the house was completely silent once again. Rollins sat on the kitchen floor next to her lifeless body, his heart hammering in his chest, sobering up instantly. He had just murdered an innocent woman in her own kitchen, with her husband and child sleeping just a few feet away upstairs. He needed help. He needed to make her disappear. He used the kitchen wall phone to call the only person he knew he could completely control, his rookie patrol partner, Deputy Paul Miller. Paul Miller was the son of the local bakery owner. He was young, corrupt, and owed his entire career to Rowlands. When Miller arrived at the back door and saw what Rowlands had done, he was terrified. But Rowlands gave him a choice: help him cover it up or take the blame for it. Miller went to his patrol car and retrieved a heavy, olive-green tactical deployment bag from the trunk. Together, they zipped Sarah's body inside. They needed a place to hide her forever. Paul Miller suggested his family's old, abandoned hunting property 12 miles out of town. The root cellar hadn't been used in 50 years. No one ever went up there. They carried the heavy canvas bag out the back door and placed it on the floor of the Jenkins family station wagon. Rowlands found Sarah's car keys on the counter. He drove her car, while Miller followed behind in his patrol cruiser. They drove the 12 miles in the dead of night. They carried her down into the cold stone cellar. They placed the bag on the dirt floor. Miller found a rusted padlock in the old cabin and used it to seal the heavy wooden doors shut from the outside. As Rowlands pulled his heavy leather gloves off to wrap the chain around the handles, his gold commendation ring caught on the rusted metal and slipped off his finger into the tall grass. He didn't even notice it was gone until hours later. With Sarah hidden away, they had to explain her missing car. Rowlands drove the station wagon all the way back to the Jenkins house. He parked it perfectly in the driveway. He wiped down the steering wheel, walked back inside, and put the keys back on the kitchen counter. Then he went home and waited for the sun to come up. At 7:00 a.m., the true genius of his evil plan began. Rowlands walked back to the Jenkins house in the morning light. He knew Mark was still asleep. He walked inside, grabbed the keys, and picked up Sarah's purse. He saw her light blue denim jacket hanging by the door. He put the jacket on, stretching the fabric over his wide shoulders. He got into the station wagon. He pushed the driver's seat all the way back. He backed out of the driveway. When the neighbor, Mr. Henderson, waved from the sidewalk, Rowlands ducked his head, kept his face hidden, and waved back. He drove 1 single mile down Route 9, exactly halfway to the Miller bakery. He pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. He took off the blue jacket, left the keys in the ignition, and tossed the purse onto the passenger seat. Then he simply walked away through the woods, circling back to his own apartment. He had created the perfect illusion. He made the entire town and the entire police force believe that a young mother vanished from her car in broad daylight. He sent the search dogs into the wrong woods. He built a 21-year nightmare out of a 12-minute lie. When the confession was finally over, the interrogation room was dead silent. The state investigators stared at the chief of police with absolute disgust. Within hours, state police arrested Paul Miller at his home. The entire truth was finally out in the open. But the hardest part of Detective Carter's job was still waiting for him. He had to go back to Oakhaven. He had to sit down with a broken husband and a fatherless son, and he had to tell them that the men who destroyed their family had been shaking their hands for 21 years. Carter drove to the quiet cul-de-sac as the sun was beginning to set. He walked up the driveway, his chest tight with anxiety. He knocked on the door. Leo answered. When he saw the look on the old detective's face, he knew immediately that the waiting was over. Carter sat in the living room with Mark and Leo. The house was incredibly quiet. Slowly, gently, Carter explained everything. He told them about the night. He told them about the 24 miles. He told them about James Rowlands and Paul Miller. When Mark heard Rowlands' name, his mind completely shattered. He remembered Rowlands sitting right where Carter was sitting now. He remembered Rowlands drinking coffee in this very kitchen, asking him questions about his marriage, pretending to look for clues, while knowing exactly where Sarah was rotting in the dark. Mark let out a sound of pure, agonizing grief. It was a guttural sob that tore through the quiet house. He collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. The betrayal was so deep, so profound, it felt like he was losing his wife all over again. Leo sat next to his father, tears streaming silently down his face. He wrapped his arms around Mark, pulling the older man against his shoulder. Leo didn't say a word. He just held his father tightly, letting the 21 years of ambiguous loss finally bleed out of their souls. The justice system moved with absolute fury. James Rowlands and Paul Miller were charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and massive civil rights violations. The trial was the most highly publicized event in the state's history, but there was no defense. The timeline, the odometer, the confession, and the gold ring painted an undeniable picture of guilt. Both men were stripped of their badges, their pensions, and their dignity. They were sentenced to life in maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. They were led out of the courtroom in heavy iron chains, forever branded as monsters in the town they had sworn to protect. 2 months after the arrests, the town of Oakhaven gathered together one final time for Sarah Jenkins. It was a bright, beautiful Sunday morning. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the air smelled of blooming spring flowers. Hundreds of people stood silently in the local cemetery. Neighbors, childhood friends, and former library coworkers came to pay their final respects. In the center of the green lawn sat a beautiful wooden casket, completely covered in white roses. Mark stood at the front of the crowd. He looked older, tired, but for the first time in 2 decades, his eyes held a sense of peace. The crushing, heavy weight of not knowing was finally gone. He didn't have to look out the front window anymore. He didn't have to wait for the phone to ring. Sarah was finally home. Before the casket was lowered into the earth, Mark walked forward. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small white paper bag. Inside was a fresh, warm cinnamon pastry. He gently placed the small bag on top of the wooden casket. It was the Mother's Day breakfast she had never gotten the chance to bring home. Leo stood beside his father. He was 25 years old, the exact age his mother had been when she was taken from him. He reached down and gently touched the polished wood of the casket. He closed his eyes, finally able to say goodbye to the mother he had only ever known through photographs and fading memories. The mystery that had haunted Oakhaven was finally put to rest. The yellow ribbons were taken down from the oak trees. The missing person posters were permanently removed from the police station walls. The town slowly began to heal, though they would never completely forget the dark lesson they had learned. Evil does not always hide in the deep woods or in the shadows of an alleyway. Sometimes, evil hides behind a bright smile, a firm handshake, and a badge of authority. Sometimes, the monsters are the people we trust the most. But the story of Sarah Jenkins also left behind a different, more powerful truth. A secret can be buried in the cold, damp earth. A door can be locked with a heavy iron chain. A timeline can be forged and a town can be fooled for decades. But the truth is a living thing. It is incredibly patient. It does not die in the dark. It simply waits. It waits for a dying man to pick up a pen. It waits for an old car to reveal its miles. It waits for a son to open a rusted lockbox. 21 years later, the truth finally found its way out of the root cellar, proving that no matter how deep the darkness goes, the light will always, eventually, find a way to break through.